Well, good morning, everybody. We've got a earlier than normal broadcast today. We had a couple of scheduling issues to work around, and so we moved the time of our conversation up an hour. Hopefully, some folks will be able to join us. If not, they can hop on later, and Terry and I will be available to answer questions if there are any that arise at the later time throughout the day. Um, Couple things that we're going to kind of begin with here right now. We're going to be discussing today the interaction of the local eldership, leaders in the local congregation, and the evangelists, and a lot about how those relationships play out and kind of how that development of maturity and all those parts can build a good congregational context where leadership is all on the same page. In many ways, that's a challenge. But before we get too deep into the conversation, Terry, how are you doing today?
Doing good. I appreciate the moving the schedule up to accommodate my needs today. Have a lot going on here, and look forward to our discussion as we kind of continue on talking about the preacher's work with the elders.
So let's get right into the heart of it, kind of just break things down. We've got three zones of consideration, if you will, that we've planned out: roles, relationships, and responsibilities. And in the last couple conversations that Terry and I've had, we talked about the work that elders do in a little bit larger context. So for right now, let's talk about how that complements, contrasts, or connects to the role of a preacher. There are definitely some carryovers from one to the other, but from a quick textual standpoint, one of the first things that we can lay out are two Bible passages. That's 1 Timothy 4, verse 16, and Acts 20, verse 28. They kind of separate the responsibilities, the roles, the relationships into two realms. And so for the preacher, the evangelist, 1 Timothy 4:16, it says, keep up a close watch on yourself and on the teaching. Acts 20, verse 28, it says, to the shepherds, to the pastors, to the elders, pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock. And so those roles are kind of separated, even though they might then mesh back together later with the preacher. The minister's work is really on what he teaches, where the elder's role is really on the flock, making sure that the sheep are tended to. So Terry, what else can we bring into that dialogue there, or perspective that would kind of help us set the stage for the conversation here?
Well, I was distracted because I wanted to thank Chris Emerson, who has joined us from the golf course today, for my custom coffee mug that he promised in the mail. And just kind of want him to just, again, we want to appreciate the Excel Still More podcasts for their support of our podcast through these custom coffee cup today. I believe he sent you a gift as well, Phillip.
Yeah, I got a custom branded morning beverage here. It's really helping me excel to be more of a monster, and I really appreciate it. It's quite tasty, and so Chris, we really appreciate your support. The cross branding work that you're doing is exceptional. How we can really lift each other up that way and help me be more of a monster than I already am.
Yeah, the cross branding by the Excel Still More broadcast is unbelievable and very, very timely. So we wanted to give our personal thanks and gratitude to Chris as we continue to troll him every week.
Yeah, it brings us small amounts of joy on a regular basis, and so it's just something that's important to us. Yeah.
We just got charged a branding fee.
Yeah, that's all right. It's all right. We'll have one of Chris's vast network of financial advisors and supporters cover that for us.
Yeah.
Maybe they
back to the show.
back to whatever it is we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Um, it's questionable. All right, so getting back to the heart of the matter, we're talking about the role of a shepherd as a part of an eldership, the role of an evangelist as part of a congregation. In each of those things, whether it's to the flock, to the teaching, that kind of creates two avenues of focus. Um, when it comes to the strong spiritual health of a local church, you're going to need both of those. Even though they're going to be dealing with the same people, you're going to be dealing with them in very distinct ways. And so they cannot live in isolation of each other. They have to be part of the same team, if you will. And I know some congregations, I've seen this recently, instead of talking about the structural leadership of the church, they might even say something more conversationally or colloquially, our team or our leadership team. And I think that's probably a healthy edge to include into the conversation because you really are on the same team in that sense.
Yeah, I
And we're
think
going to
by the
talk a
way
little
that
bit about building that way in a second.
yeah, I think that
Go
makes
ahead.
some people cringe by the way when we say that. And it shouldn't. Um
Hmm.
I think there is this kind of mindset when we talk about roles within the church that we only view the elders as leaders in that sense. And I just I don't think that's quite true.
Well, I'll just say that at least from
Purpose.
my perspective, oh, uh, Terry's at a remote location just about, so it feels like his feed is popping in and out with the video. And so as that gets kind of straightened out here in a second, I'll cover some space. But at least as far as I can see it, Terry was talking about how you back, Terry?
I'm going to
Uh,
change locations real quick, so I'm going to drop out and then I'll rejoin you. We'll see how
all
that
right.
works. Okay.
Yeah. So Terry will be back with us in just a second. Let me tie a couple things together. Um, Terry's right. I do think we are uncomfortable at times with the presentation of an idea that there are leadership capacities, even structured leadership capacities, that are held by someone who is not the elder or an elder, if you will. And it's going even beyond the look into um, servant leaders like deacons. And I think that's maybe even a better term to kind of slide in there too, which is a servant who leads. Um, but in a practical way, those who teach Bible classes regularly of all genders and of all capacities, they're leading those discussions. Um, to those who lead someone to Christ, you're leading them. You lead in your home. I think there's a lot more leadership potential that's taking place in local churches than we're willing to kind of classify or categorize because um, we're not quite sure what to do with that. And so, what Terry and I are trying to talk about right now is how do we integrate in the local preacher's perspective to those things so that the local evangelist, the preacher in that connection, can then, in a very healthy and good way, um, be a participant in the work that's going on in the congregational context. Because I'll talk about this practically. For me, over the years of my work evangelistically and my work in local churches, I would say at this point about half of it has been in congregational context where we've had an active shepherd group engaged in the local church, and about half of it has been in context where we've been building those leaders for the future. And at least for me, most of my interactions in those times have been incredibly positive, and all of them have been good for the local church where we've figured out a way to work together. Um, and it's changed too in the process. As a younger evangelist, I was less likely to be called into conversations that the elders were having. And it didn't bother me much because I understood a couple things. One, I didn't have any or all the answers to most of the questions that came up. And so me knowing it didn't really change anything. Uh, Older now, more experienced, the gray hair has started to rise on my face a little bit. Um, those conversations shifted as I got older, where it was more likely that I was sought out for expertise in smaller areas where I had more experience. So those kind of things should be taking place. There should be that level of separation between maturity and goals that are going to kind of be those cross points between the role of an elder and the role of an evangelist and how we
Maturity.
build a relationship together. Terry's getting his audio fixed out. Terry, are you good now? Do you feel like you're in a personal safe space?
I don't know how safe it is, but at least it seems that the connection may be better. How about that?
Okay. So, going back to what we're talking about, working with, and we'll kind of get down to the heart of the matter right now, working with an eldership in the consideration of role, relationship, and responsibility is an exercise in trust in many ways. You can define the roles as two different areas, but you're trying to build a relationship where you trust one another. And you can easily tell, especially because of past experiences, you can look back and say, well, this is when we didn't trust each other like we should have. And I'll give you illustrations, and Terry can in a second too. You can tell you don't trust each other when you intentionally exclude someone who may have expertise on the area from the discussion. And so if the elders or a preacher group is meeting, like, oh, no, this is not for the elders, this is not for the preacher, or the preachers, if the congregation has more than one, that often means, if it's intentional, that there's a level of trust issue taking place there where we don't trust one another with this information, with this conversation.
Phil, let me say something about that. I think that happens a lot, and you are on both sides of this equation now, which is a little bit different. I am not. I'm only on the preacher side. And I think one of the things to point out about this is that I don't know that elders intentionally realize the exclusion of the preacher from some conversations is a sign of distrust or is taken as that way. And so I think one of the things to point out to maybe shepherds who may hear this is this fact, as I try to get a little bit more situated here, it is this fact that when you do exclude us from conversations, whether it's a lack of trust or not, it is perceived as a lack of trust. And I can tell you, I know of situations where I perceive things as a lack of trust that really weren't of lack of trust as much as it was sometimes the ignorance of the eldership as far as understanding how that is perceived by me as the preacher. And I think that's one of the things that needs to be pointed out here. I don't want us to, we're going to be open and honest about this, and I don't want it to be taken as personal or as criticism, although I guess some of it is criticism in the long run if you fall in these categories. But we do want, especially elders, to understand the perception from, quote, the other side of the table when these are the kind of things that happen. And so what you say is important to understand. The exclusion of the evangelist from a lot of conversations shows a sign of distrust or a lack of trust. Even if you're not wanting it to, it's perceived that way. And you need to understand that when you do that. And I'll tell you that you mentioned earlier as I was getting set back up that when you were younger, you realized you didn't have as much to add to the conversation. And as we get older, we do. I will tell you one of my failures is that when I was younger, I thought I had more to add to the conversation than I actually did. And that caused problems for me in my work. I've been open about that. At the same time now, as I get older, while that has been tempered because of my experience, I realize I have more to add to the conversation than sometimes is realized. And that is where understanding this kind of idea of how these roles work independently but also cooperatively from a biblical standpoint has to come together. I don't know if you talked about Ephesians 4:11, but my understanding of Ephesians 4:11 is that us as evangelists and shepherds are to work together for the building up of the church spiritually and to do the work. it's hard to do that when there's not good communication,
Yeah.
and not trust. Trust is a huge part
Well,
of that.
right. And here's a couple tips from my own perspective, and I'll lay this out from trying to hop on two sides of the fence, because, and I'll say this plainly, my side of the fence, that's the elder side, it's like, hey, I'm new here. I have no idea what I'm doing. That's kind of how I feel a lot of the times when it comes to experiential knowledge. But I'll talk about this from on the receiving end as an evangelist. When I moved to Cookville, one of the things that the elders did there is they established a habit of meeting with me, with the two of them, for breakfast at the 13th Street Country Cafe on a regular basis. And at that breakfast, we would share the breakfast together and talk about life and just being who we were and what's going on in our lives. And then we would always shift to the work of the congregation. And it became a structured habit, and we got to know each other in those conversations. I knew they had conversations beyond that, that where I was not part of. And I was like, that's totally cool. And I always told them, look, if you need me to preach on something, it's almost better if I don't know why, um,
Yeah.
all the whys about it, because then it's more likely that I can do the job that you want me to do. And at
Well, you
that
won't
point in my
weaponize the
life,
pulpit then. When if you
yeah,
don't know the
you know,
why,
and
you won't go directly at somebody.
right. And so they were very conscious of not always telling me what to preach. And so about every 2 months, on average, it felt like they'd say, "Hey, could you do a lesson on something?" And it was all over the place. And I'm like, "Okay, we'll try to figure it out." And we figured it out, and I put it into the program what we were going to be doing. And so that's the process there. But for the evangelist side of things, what that did is it put me into a mentored relationship with two older Christians who could help me grow, and who are also my shepherds. And I'll tell you that bringing your evangelist into those meetings on a regular basis will only make the relationship better. Um, you will know each other better. You will trust each other more. And then when you tell them, hey, we met and you weren't there and we decided this, they're like, okay, because this is Ray and Faye and I know them. And when they meet, I know that they're going to be meeting about stuff that's important and I'll trust them. Uh, so my suggestion on a practical level is meet regularly with your evangelists, with your preachers, with your teachers, to get to know them and to be around them. And tell them, hey, we also will meet in other capacities because we believe we need to do that too. And tell them, hey, like, we're doing this. It's intentional. And then gradually, what happened in my case is the times they met independent without me eventually vanished. The only times they met in absence of my presence toward the end of that eldership's work was when they discussed my financial matters. And I was totally cool with that because I didn't really need to be there. Um, and so, um, and Bob is bringing up a great point that we'll talk about too,
Yeah.
that comes from the other end, that the preacher's side of trust. But that's a built thing. We're trying to build a relationship, and it's an intentional building of relationship.
Sure.
That doesn't happen overnight. So that's part of the practical side is be intentional about it. Have a plan. Have a plan that includes the leadership in the congregation in all of its edges and all of its ways. And so Bob's comment, which I'll bring for everybody in case they're not seeing the comment stream, is objectively we have to acknowledge that trust both ways. An evangelist is too concerned about being excluded from a particular meeting may need to trust the elders more. That's absolutely true. The
Yeah.
part of what Terry's bringing in and part of what he and I have talked about before is that what's the pattern here? If it's a regular pattern of continued exclusion or distance, like the relationship is basically breaking up, then it becomes hard to maintain the goals of the group together because you kind of want the insight of the primary teacher in a lot of those meetings because you want to know what's going to be taught and you want to know why they want to teach it the way that they do. and no amount of white sheet paper information can bridge that gap to this is why. This is the emotive reason why.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to add to Bob's comment, maybe a further explanation, is that the issue of trust does not have to do necessarily with the meeting. It's more about the communication and, as you said, also the pattern. So if the only time you meet with your elders is when something wrong has happened, that is going to build a trust issue over time.
Yeah,
Look, one of the things you've got to understand is if that's the way the elders work, is the only time we really meet with the preacher is when we're having issues with him or at the church. That's what builds up this idea among, especially the preacher's family. You know, I'm in a good place and everything seems to be going well and the church is going well, but still to this day, if I because of past experience, if I get called into an elders meeting, if there's not a regular set pattern, and I get called into that elders meeting, the first question I get when I get home is, "Are we having to move?"
yeah,
And part of that is built upon there not being a pattern of meeting and not being communication. So, one of my things is, hey, I know you're going to meet without me. That's fine, and um, but we should be open and transparent about that instead of it being kind of this secluded, hidden meeting. Like if you're, and that's I think part of the thing is, as elders, I would encourage you to meet regularly with the deacons. I would encourage you to meet regularly with the evangelist, and have discussions with the evangelist about things, and to meet regularly just as yourselves, but be open and honest about that and not make it so that it's almost like these secret backroom meetings. That's what really kind of builds up some of the not resentment, but the questions of trust. And
yeah,
I'll add to that one more thing. Even at times when the trust seemed to break down between me and the elders, I was still publicly their greatest defender. And one of the reasons you need to trust your, I think, evangelist is not only is he the most um, prevalent teacher in the congregation, he's also the most public presenter, speaker in general. And you want him to be able to defend you publicly. He is in some places, and this is just the reality. Maxwell talks about leadership being influence, and that being the main definition of it is your influence. In a lot of places, unfortunately, the preacher has more influence than the eldership. And one of the things to keep in mind about that is you want to communicate and have that kind of relationship that allows him to publicly promote you and your work as an eldership, defend you, and to share the trust he has in your eldership with the congregation to build their trust. Nobody can build a trust within the eldership and the congregation more than the preacher can, which is one of the reasons I think that's so important. So these roles are different, but one more thing, I guess, and I lied and said one more thing earlier, as far as relationships. I think the relationships goes beyond, really and truthfully for me at this point. I think it has to be more than just a working relationship, and I think that's what you're kind of pointing at too. We need to genuinely like each other. Like we don't have to be best friends, but we need to like each other. We need to like working together, but we need to like not working together. If my relationship with the eldership is only a work-based relationship, that's not the kind of relationship that's going to make us most successful.
yeah,
It's best for us to be friends outside of the meetings and to have genuine interest. That benefits us as a group and it benefits the work because that also builds trust. You can build this trust when you're not talking about church stuff. Um, and I've found that if I trust an elder as a man outside of his position, I trust that man in his position because after all, that's how elders are appointed. It's the way we trust the man before he's given the title. And so I find that I can develop a sense of trust even more with him outside of that relationship as just evangelist and shepherd.
yeah. Let me,
Enough rambling for me.
Oh, rambling is what we do. Um, we've got about 6, 7 minutes of our planned time left. I'll add a couple of things and then a comment from Chris I think needs to be given some attention. I really think it's important to piggyback Terry's comment about liking your leadership. You should be able to laugh and cry with the shepherds that watch over your souls, especially if you've been tasked with specific responsibility in the local church. You're going to spend a lot of time together figuring out what that future looks like. And so you want to be able to go to a game with them. They show up at your kid's event. You go to dinner or lunch with them because you really just want to spend time with them. I think that's a healthy relationship. If you can't figure out how to build that relationship just yet, keep working at it. The things we're talking about aren't permanent situations on the negative end. We're also trying to lay out some groundwork to say it can and should be better. And even if you haven't figured it out yet, start thinking about it. What works for us? Chris brings up a good point. He didn't charge us for this either, at least not yet.
Not yet.
But it'll probably be a future podcast that he'll do next year. He says, let me share with you guys something we started here that has made a big difference for me. I meet with the elders once a month in their shepherding meeting. Our focus is upon sheep. The agreement is that I will never be surprised by a question or a correction or anything like that. If they have something to address with me, an elder will come to see me in private meeting before, and I will never go into a meeting not knowing what I will be asked about. Like in most cases, we learned this through a bit of friction. It really did, I think, change the feel of the meetings. I think that ties us together with something that Terry and I have talked about beforehand. In a good relationship, a healthy relationship, it should never be a surprise that things aren't going well and you're going to go into a meeting and they're going to just drop a bomb on you. Those should not really be happening.
Yeah, I can promise you with me, by the way, with my type A personality, that if you bring me in a meeting and you surprise me, and I am better at this now. I mean, I've had that happen where I sat there for so long quietly, I was asked what I thought. But I can tell you, especially Terry, when he was in his early 30s, that was not handled properly by me because that surprise immediately kicks up my defense mechanisms and I go into that defense mode. That's natural for all of us, by the way. And what I really like about what Chris said is that there's no surprises. You have time to kind of digest what's going on and be able to give a measured response that isn't offensive to anybody. Most of the personality conflicts that occur in this relationship happen because one or the other is taken off guard. Look, the preacher can go in and he can do something very similarly. And I've not always handled that well in the past either. I know before we had elders, it was with some men in a meeting. But when I made a decision to leave, which wasn't a decision because there was any issues, but it was perceived very hostile when it was not intended to be that way. And I could have handled that differently. I could imagine working with elders that would need to be handled differently too. But that goes back again, as we said, Phil, to trust. Part of the issue there is, and I think this is what that's what I heard too, is they trust each other enough to have those conversations, but also they trust Chris enough to give him a little head start on preparing his reception of that. And I really like that. I really appreciate Chris's comment about that.
Yeah, and that's a conversation that you can have in a structured way that says, look, this is what we're going to do. You're part of this meeting, but you're still over here in this realm of responsibility. We don't want you to be surprised. And so if we need to talk to you about something, we're going to tell you about it ahead of time so you can prepare. I'm the same way. If I'm called to participate in a conversation, I want to make sure that I've researched what it is I need to know. Whether it's about the flock, whether it's about me, my work, the word. I don't like to just do stuff on the fly. I can, and certainly when needs arise, that's what we do. But I love to have a plan so that I can kind of know this is what I intend to think about, and these are the really important parts of that. And it gives me a chance to calm down sometimes too, because I can certainly empathize and sympathize with Terry that sometimes my failures are because I didn't handle a surprise well. And even and I'll be open about this, in my departure from the church at Jerry Whitson Road, um, it was in part precipitated by a surprise, where I felt like things were going just fine, and a couple of the men the day before our big business meeting came to me, just two of them, and said, "When this takes place, we're going to suggest that you should leave." And I was like, "What in the world?" And so I was surprised. Yes, it was the day before, but it was the day before after 13 years of never hearing a lick about it. So
Yeah.
there's some surprise events there, and I chose to leave in part because of that surprise.
Well, and
Um,
in my
and
story, by the way, of my departure, it was a surprise as well. It was actually two stages of surprise, but mixed in that was, um, quite frankly, a discussion earlier that was presented almost as a vote of confidence that then a few months later turned into this surprise of not having confidence. Um,
yeah,
and that doesn't go well. That just doesn't, um, that obviously doesn't end well. And that's one of the reasons we ended up moving as well. Um, and that's, as I mentioned earlier, part of that is my fault. I mean, I look back and realize I did a lot of things to cause that, um, and not handling this relationship well. And by the time, quite frankly, that I made some attempts to repair some of the damage I had done, it was too late. And I hope that I'm a better person for that. And I hope discussions like this will help guys like me not make the same mistakes that I did, um,
hmm
and to hopefully not have those same issues in that sense. I will
right.
say one of the things, and we can go a few minutes. I know I told you hard fast, but I got a few minutes. I will say one of the things I've had to learn to do is I do have to trust, because we get to responsibilities we're not talking about a lot. I have to trust the elders to fulfill their responsibilities of shepherding. And
hmm
even when I don't agree necessarily with all the things they may decide to do, I have to trust them as the shepherds, as leaders. And that's something that I've learned, but it was not learned easily. And I think that's hard for us because as preachers, one of the challenges of this, just speaking honestly, is this is what we do with our full time life. We think about the work of the church literally all the time. I'm sure you're the same way, Phil, but it's not 24/7, but it's probably 22 and a half 7. I mean, it is even when you think I'm not thinking about things with the church, I'm thinking about things with the church. And most of your shepherds have a full-time job away from that they
hmm
think about. They may think about um, their small business or whatever company they work for or their practice. They may think about that more than they think about, at least in your perception, and that's important too. That doesn't mean that they don't understand and have knowledge and wisdom to do the right thing. And so the that's one of the key things I think for preachers to understand, especially younger preachers. And that was one of my failings was you may think you have a better way, but your job first and foremost is to trust them. You cannot get in the pulpit and quote Hebrews 13:17 to people, but think it doesn't apply to you. Um,
Yeah.
and so that's one of the keys to all of this as well.
And I'll say that it's a challenge to do so. And I'll say that the most important time to trust your leaders is when you're not quite sure why they're making a decision. Um, it doesn't mean that the decision they've made is one you agree or disagree with. It's why they made that choice. That's where the highest structural trust strain seems to take place. And it's imperative for those who preach to literally get behind the work in a public way and saying, this is where we're going, and this is what we need to do right now. And I would implore then shepherds to help the evangelist understand the why, because that will help the evangelist grow up in Christ. And so you've got to really kind of figure out how to be aware and assertive in the relationship building side of things, As a companion, yeah, the work of the preacher is a all the time thing. I'm never not a preacher. I get introduced that way. People see me that way, um, and and so it's a challenge to turn that switch off, if you will. Um, but then it also then, for our purposes here, what Terry brought it up for this reason. We're tending to think about this maybe more so than others have opportunity to. It's a nature of the work. So be mindful of that to those who shepherd local churches. To those who are preachers, I'll say this, and this is something that Terry and I always kind of work on. Find a way to turn the switch off and be a disciple, be a father, be a friend. Find people you can trust to be friends with who will, make fun of you publicly because maybe you need to be brought down a notch or two, or straighten you out a little bit. Yeah, that's a plug right there. Or just, that are just good friends and you have good times with, because you need those
Yeah.
things. And may it be that those friends are also your shepherds. If I could pray for the best environment, those friends would be the ones who are shepherding your soul that you get to see regularly. But it isn't always the case that they're that close. I wish that it was. Terry,
Yeah.
last comments. I've got a couple things I want to drop before we
Yeah.
close out for today.
Let me say this to any shepherds who may watch this. I think one of the things also to maybe follow up my comment to the preachers to trust the shepherds is we do want you to trust us. Um, do realize that we as preachers not only think about this stuff a lot, but we've devoted our life to this work. And in addition to that, um, I read, and I think you're the same way, Phil. We do a lot of academic stuff. I think you do a little bit more than that than I do. But in addition to that, I read a lot of the church growth stuff. I read a lot of the church strategy stuff. And there's a place for that and there's a need for that. And I study a lot of, through conversations with other guys, what's working in other places and things like evangelism and all these things. We are a tremendous resource because of the time we spend on our meditation and our research and our prayer about how to spread the gospel and how to grow the kingdom. And so just recognize that from a pure time spent meditating on this, we have a lot to offer in those discussions, and
Yeah.
learn to trust that resource and use that resource, because it will cause us to all work better together, and it will cause the kingdom to grow better as well. And so, just an appeal to that side to think about that as well.
All right, so that's it for our time that we've got laid out for today. We've got a couple things on the agenda in the future. I wanted to drop a couple things though before we close out. One is one little quick tip for shepherds. Take your evangelist with you over the next couple of weeks to wherever you grow your ability to lead, whether that's to a seminar, whether it's to someone's home, whether it's to your place of work. If you grow your leadership somewhere, grab that evangelist by the scruff of his neck and say, hey, you're coming with me today. And tell them that you'll both be better for it. And so find some time to strengthen one another in that way. Another thing to consider, upcoming broadcast ideas. I know you might have some for us. We've got some planned as well. In the future, we're going to be hopefully able to talk to those who lead trips overseas to Bible lands and talk to them some about why that's of value. We've got some more conversations with Mac Dawson. Dawson still stacked on the list. A few others possible as well. But if you got those topics you want to bring to us, let us know. We'll try to get the schedule planned out for the rest of the year. We certainly will also have a couple of Tuesdays during November as it closes out and December, where we'll probably take a week off so that we don't have this on top of our table when all the family is crowding around the house. And so Terry and I will work that out. But like, comment, share all the social media things if you can. Terry, last goodbye before I click the button.
Goodbye.
Yeah. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great day.
Have a great day.